Recording in progress. Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, 6 o'clock. Here we are. Welcome, online participants. Welcome, folks in the room, to the groundwater allocation meeting here in Central Point. Hopefully, folks had an opportunity to look at some of the background materials. I see a lot of these in front of folks. This sheet here is just it's a timeline of the conversations about groundwater that have occurred to date. And on the back is a little bit of a cheat sheet that gives you highlights of some of the presentations, so you can go right to a staff report or a presentation that's most interesting to you. And I also saw people with these paper surveys in front of them, and some folks are filling those out. It'd be good if you had one in front of you, because as you listen to the presentation, you might want to make notes to yourself, or you might want to add some things on the survey. And for folks online, you can look in the chat, and there will be a link to both of these materials. And for the background sheet, there'll be hot links to all of the staff reports and the videos, so that you can watch those as well. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jamie Damon, and I'm with Kearns & West, a consulting firm. I'm supporting Water Resources Department in these meetings around the state. We have had meetings in Salem. We've been in Bend and LeGrand, and here we are with all of you. We have one more meeting next week. That's a virtual meeting. So thank you, Justin. So our time together is until 8 o'clock. And the way we've got it organized, if you want to go to the next slide. There we go. Oh, well, first, a few tips. So for our virtual attendees, for all of you online, please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. We also can mute you from here, so don't worry about that too much. When it comes time for the Q&A, you can raise your hand. And either just physically raise your hand or use the raise the hand function. If you use the raise the hand function, that's really the best, because it puts you in the queue so that we know who's in line for speaking. So do try to use the raise hand button, or press *9 on your phone if you're just calling in. We do have the chat open for folks online. We ask that you use it for technical issues or to ask a question if you can't raise your hand for some reason. Please refrain from having an online discussion using the chat, and we will not be answering questions in the chat. And use your webcam as much as you're comfortable during the Q&A. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Justin. So for our agenda for everybody, like I said, our time together is we're here till 8 o'clock. We've got a presentation from Justin, who will introduce himself here in just a little bit. It goes till about 6:45, and then the rest of the time is really for your questions and your input to the Water Resources Department. So we tried to have a lot of time for that. And if you could hold your questions until the Q&A time to allow Justin to get through his presentation, what we found is that a lot of the questions that you might be thinking about may be answered in his presentation. But do make a note to yourself of things that you want to ask during the Q&A. And same with folks online. We won't answer questions during the presentation, but make a note to yourself of something you want to ask. And we'll do a few minutes before 8 just about next steps, what's happening, how you can access all the meeting summaries from all the meetings, the recordings from this meeting, the presentation, and all of that. And then we'll adjourn at 8 o'clock. So I've got one more slide if you want to advance it for me, Justin. Thank you. We do have some meeting guidelines, and this is for everybody online and in the room. We ask that you honor the agenda. Straightforward. We've got a presentation. We have a big conversation with all of you together. Participate actively and respectfully. We hope that's why you're here. Be mindful of your speaking time. We've got about 25 people online, and we've got about 22, 24 people in the room. We should be able to get to everybody that wants to say something. And so what I'll try to do is give people a chance to speak who haven't spoke yet before I circle back around for people with follow-up questions and to speak again. Respect differences of opinion and perspective. There's a lot of opinions and perspectives on these topics, so we expect to hear that. Stay on mute when you're not speaking for people online, but also for folks in the room. So do refrain from side conversations. That's the second to the last bullet there. And I already talked about the online survey. You can provide your input either physically on the survey today through raising your hand and talking with us, through online after the meeting, take the survey home and mail it back in. Lots of ways to get your input. I think it's time for me to hand it over to Ivan.
Thanks, Jamie. Welcome, everybody. I wanted to start out by doing some introductions of some of our staff around the room. With me tonight is Justin Iverson. He manages our groundwater section, one of our key hydrogeologists. In the back of the room is Jake Johnstone. He's our interim division administrator for our field services division. So he works with our field staff across the state. Annette Leva at the back table is our division administrator for the technical services division. So Justin's groundwater section is part of her division there. Justin Dillon is our Southwest region manager. And Justin, maybe real quickly, you can intro your staff.
Yeah, two of our assistant line masters. There's 18 positions that support everyone in this region are here in Nevada. We got Genesee M, Cory Jan, and Ben Carson.
So why are we here tonight? We're embarking on a sorry. Yeah, that might help. Ivan Gall, I'm the interim deputy director for the Water Resources Department. Very familiar with this area, grew up in Ashland, worked out of our Grants Pass office for 9 years as a regional hydrogeologist, and have been popping around the state doing various different jobs for the agency ever since. Our agency has embarked on a process to modernize our groundwater allocation policy and procedures. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is and what it isn't here. We really want this to be kind of a listening session for us to hear input from you. You will have questions tonight. We will try and answer as many of those as we can, but we're really looking for feedback on our process and approach. You probably won't have all of that feedback tonight. So as Jamie mentioned, we've got paper forms, and there's also an online form on our project webpage, which is probably the easiest thing to access and get comments in. We'll be accepting comments through middle of October.
October 19th.
October 19th on that. Talking a little bit about what we're doing tonight. The groundwater allocation process is only used for new groundwater right applications. These are typically the larger groundwater uses. We want to come up with an updated and modernized process to assess water availability for new groundwater rights. We want that process to be protective of senior water right holders, both surface water right holders and groundwater right holders. And we want this allocation process to result in sustainable aquifer systems across the state. And Justin will get into some details on that sustainability concept. What this process is not going to affect are exempt wells or exempt uses from wells. And I've got the next slide here that will go into a little more detail on that. This process does not affect regulation of existing water rights. And this process does not affect any of our water right transfer processes. So if you have a water right in the state and you want to make some changes to that, you go through a water right transfer process. This allocation modernization process won't affect the transfer process at all. Next slide, please. Exempt groundwater uses. I wanted to touch on this because they're near and dear to many folks in rural Oregon. An exempt groundwater use is a use of groundwater that's exempt from needing a water right as per our statutes. There's a number of exemptions that fall into this category. I've listed the 4 major ones here. 15,000 gallons per day for single or group domestic use. You can also take 5,000 gallons per day for an industrial or a commercial use. Stock water is exempt. And irrigation of up to 1/2 acre of lawn or non-commercial garden is exempt as well. And then there's 3 other seldom used ones that I won't go into. These exempt uses are not part of the process tonight and will continue on without being affected by this allocation process. Wanted to put into context sort of where we've been, where are we, and where are we going with this process. We've got a timeline up here for you. The process started about a year ago. we started having discussions with the Water Resources Commission. Justin did a number of presentations there and it looked at our allocation process. This spring, we started developing concepts to modernize this process. Later this summer, at one of our commission meetings, we got direction from the commission to go around the state and gather additional public input. And that's really where we are tonight. This is our fourth meeting of 5. We started out in Salem, and then last week we were in Bend and LeGrand, Medford, Central Point tonight, and our 5th and final meeting will be on Monday, October 10th. I think from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, and that's an all virtual meeting. So if you've got additional questions or want to get additional comments or suggestions in, you can join virtually Monday afternoon. Later this fall, our intent is to convene a team internally to start drafting rules. So these rules will take into consideration some of the ideas and suggestions that Justin will present, as well as comments and suggestions from these outreach meetings. Following the drafting of those internal rules, we will convene a rule advisory committee. So that's a committee of folks made up of members from the public that are interested in participating and have some interest in groundwater use around the state. And we are very ambitiously proposing to get rules in front of our commission late spring 2023 for adoption. So that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Justin. He's got about a 35-40 minute presentation. He'll walk you through some basic groundwater hydrology, talk to you a little bit about our current allocation process, and then discuss some ideas that we have to help modernize that.
And while Justin's getting settled, just a reminder to, we'll take questions at 6:45 when his presentation is done. And for folks online, let us know how the sound is, because he's a little bit away from the speaker. Oh, you've got your own, great.
Okay, so hopefully that's picking up, everybody can hear okay. All right. So as I said, well, once again, I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section for WRD based out of Salem. Going to basically give us a relatively quick background so that we have hopefully a common understanding of kind of key groundwater concepts and how hydrologic system works. And then in the second part of the talk, I will talk about groundwater allocation issues and some proposed solutions. These aren't all the issues nor the solutions, just a few significant ones from my perspective to kind of provide an example of where we're coming from and where we're going. So we're looking for comments along those lines during our public engagement process. With you. I am going to re-emphasize this sheet that's shown on the presentation, available physical copy in the back. This provides links to background information going all the way back to October 2016. And the presentation that I'm going to be giving tonight is a 30-minute distillation of materials from at least these 6 significant presentations to our Water Resources Commission. I will do my best to point out when I'm talking about topics that are in each of these, but there's a little synopsis on the back that'll help find what's of interest. And for more detail, you can go to the linked staff reports or the presentations for each of these dynamics and get, like I said, more detail about what we're talking about, because given the time we've got, this is going to be really high level and generalized. So this is the generally true state of the system for Oregon as a whole. There's always details that are glossing over. There's location specific issues that are going to vary from place to place. But on the whole, this is generally how things work, and we're talking about statewide rules here that are intended in the end to do our best job to give a little playing field to everybody. So with that, I'm going to step into the first section here, key groundwater concepts. Going to talk about just very basic, what is groundwater, talk about how groundwater fits into the overall hydrologic cycle, and then talk about the source of groundwater wells, which is really the crux of the matter. And then we'll go on to more of the policy stuff from there. And so first, what is groundwater? So just want to be clear that what we're talking about is water that exists in pore space of sediments and fractures in volcanic rock. We are not talking about underground rivers or lakes, but rather the water that exists under the ground in most places of the state to some degree. And we are talking about groundwater in context. So in the context of the hydrologic cycle. So groundwater doesn't sit underground separate from everything. It's not a stagnant resource. It is moving. It receives recharge from infiltration of precipitation or snowmelt over time. That water enters the ground, enters the groundwater system, and it's flowing. It's going someplace. And because it's going someplace, it exits the ground someplace. And in most cases, that is exiting to springs, seeps, stream flow, right? So that's before we ever put in any wells, the hydrologic cycle was operating, there was water going in, and on the whole, over some amount of time, it's in general equilibrium. So the amount of water coming out of the groundwater system was about equal to the amount of water coming in, right? So it's there's some balance there. Going to zoom way into a more simple section. This small block diagram, this and all the other, well, I should say that many of the generalized figures depicting how groundwater operates are taken from U.S. Geological Circulars. This one is from a circular that's titled Groundwater and Surface Water, a Single Resource. And again, want to focus on the fact that this is showing a recharge area across the land surface, infiltration of precipitation, snowmelt, other sources of water that infiltrates into the ground, joins the water table, joins the groundwater system, flows to the right of the screen here, and is discharging to the stream. For folks that kind of imagine better with a real life picture, I'm going to put this another way. This is picture of Eagle Creek, county to remain unnamed. This is the spot that I go to in August or September when it's hot in town and I want to get up into the hills. And this creek is flowing in August, September when it hasn't rained in 2 or 3 months. This is in the wilderness area. There's no datum above it. It's relatively low elevation. There's no snowpack. Yet that stream's running at about that level all the time. And it is running dominantly because of groundwater discharge, right? That water that's in that creek right there has infiltrated to the hills. It's flowed down gradient. Gradient being what drives groundwater flow from high gradient to low gradient, just like heat goes from high temperature to low temperature, electricity from high voltage to low voltage. Groundwater moves from high potential to low potential as both gravity and pressure working together. So infiltrating up on the sides, on the highlands, flowing down to the valley, coming out in that stream, and that stream is flowing. And I sincerely hope that you guys can all imagine in your mind your favorite small creek that's running this time of year, and think about why that is. If that's not dam regulated, and if there's not a snow patch above it, that's groundwater coming in. Another term we have for that is base flow, right? That's the amount of flow that's kind of baseline in that stream.
Hey,
Right.
Justin, I'm moving this closer to you
Okay, sounds great.
so people can hear you better. Knock it
All
off.
right.
Don't knock it
Yeah,
off.
right. No, don't wander away. Okay. So I'm going to come back to this block diagram and talk about what happens when we collect some of that groundwater through wells. So the way in which a well works is it's drilled down into the ground, we remove some of that geologic material, we put in casing to hold that material out, we put a screen toward the bottom, again, to hold the solids out, allow the water to flow in. And once we put a pump in there and turn it on, we start to pull water out, and we're removing water, and water from the surrounding aquifer then flows in. It flows again because of this gradient that I was just describing. So at early time, when that pump is first turned on, it is actually removing water from storage. So that original picture I had up here had this water table going straight across the stream. And in this diagram, we see that that water table is bending down toward the well. That's called, it's termed the cone of depression. So that's depressing the water table. It's that lowering of the water table that sets up that potential that drives groundwater flow toward a well. Okay. And these flow lines that, again, in the first picture without the well went straight to the stream are now flowing toward the well, because that's the lowest point of the system. That's the low point where water is going to flow to. And so over time, the source of water to this well starts to change. So at early time, again, we have pulled the water table down, and now I've drawn on here with my pen to kind of show where the water table used to be and where the water table is now with this cone of depression and this area in between of drained pore space. At early time, that's drained out, and that cone of depression is expanding outward. And in this case, once it reaches the stream, assuming that geologic material is such that water can flow, relatively freely, that hydraulic regime now is set up such that we're pulling water out of the stream, and the cone of depression isn't going to grow anymore. We're not going to drain much more pore space because we have captured this flow that was either going toward the stream and was headed toward discharging there, or we're adding flow from the stream. So we have captured stream flow at that point, okay? Or just base flow, I should say. We've captured water that would otherwise be base flow. So I'm going to look at that now in the form of a graph, and the point of this graph is to show these two sources of water to wells and how they change over time. So on the x-axis here, we have pumping time from turning a pump on to sometime into the future. And on the y-axis here, we have the percentage of groundwater pumping rate that comes from water from storage along this line and water from stream flow depletion along this line. So again, the stream flow depletion is the capture of the water that was otherwise along this flow path headed to discharge in a stream. And when the water is first, or when a pump is first turned on, water from storage makes up 100% of the water flowing to wells, right? We're draining that pore space. But as we drain that pore space and drop the water table and again set up a new pressure regime, then the water that we are capturing, or the water to the well from stream flow depletion, increases. And with increasing time, eventually we set up a situation where almost all or all of the water we're capturing is from stream flow depletion. So that was that last block diagram I showed. For folks that think better in terms of just pithy statements, I guess, I put this up here. This is I put this up here mostly because this quote comes from 1940, right? So Charles Tice was one of the early engineers that helped develop quantitative groundwater science. And 82 years ago, he said, from the standpoint of groundwater conservation, statutory or other regulation, the following point should be emphasized. All water discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water somewhere. So again, we had a hydrologic cycle, water was going into the groundwater system and out at about equal rates over the long term. And when we install a well, we are taking water either from that dynamic storage and or from this through flow. Okay, so that's an important concept to understand, and that's great, right? I mean, from the perspective of developing anything we do, from a rural homestead to irrigated agriculture, we're in a situation in most of Oregon where we can drill a well almost anywhere. It's a three-dimensional distribution system. And all we need to do is put a well in. We don't need big, long lateral ditches or pipes necessarily to get water to where we want to use it. We can tap into this three-dimensional water distribution system and get, for the most part, potable water that's suitable for the use that we're looking for. Okay, but again, it's not just sitting down there by itself. It's part of a bigger system, and we have to understand the impacts of doing that. So, given all that I've just gone over, it will hopefully not be a stretch of the imagination to understand that groundwater allocation over the past 65 plus years. So we started allocating groundwater statewide in 1955, has contributed to both reduced surface water base flow in some parts of the state and groundwater level declines in some other parts of the state. And that both of those things come at the expense of senior users, of existing users, right? Base flow in August and September is some of the key surface water resources that Native folks, before development and the earliest irrigators were all depending on, right? Like that groundwater discharge to streams that kept those streams going in our seasonal drought, that's depended on by very senior people. And similarly, where we've had water tables close to the surface that have been developed by shallow hand dug wells for homesteads, or with increasing time for deeper wells, that's dependent on, right? And so as we allocate more and more, again, we are capturing water that's already being depended upon by others. So with that, I'm going to step into the second part of the presentation, and I'm going to talk about, again, just a few issues that our existing allocation process has created, and some potential solutions that might be there, again, just to get folks thinking about this. So again, let's just reiterate what I said. Issues arising from our existing process, initial ideas for updating that process. I'm going to talk about two kind of key issues that occur with our existing process that are related to those two sources of water to wells. First of all, the capture of surface water. A key issue is that our current rules and policy are set up such that we protect against short-term and acute impacts to surface water. We avoid that in our current process. However, cumulative impacts that develop over time are develop and grow and continue to impact surface water, and our current process doesn't take that into account, right? We review new water rights for, hey, are the wells in proximity to surface water? Are they within a mile of surface water? And we review impacts within an irrigation season or a year. We don't look at long-term impacts. We don't look at, well, this well is here, but there were wells here before and before and before, and they cumulatively add up to more and more stream flow impact. Second issue that I'm going to focus on tonight is with respect to storage as a source of water to wells. Data right now in our existing process must exist to indicate over appropriation. So we have to basically have groundwater level data in the vicinity of a new application to assess the stability of that water level. And before we would take action and say, hey, water levels are declining or not. You know, in the absence of data, we've assumed stability and ability to continue to develop. So given those two aspects of our current review process, we found in June of 21, and I'm sorry, I said I was going to refer back to this placemat and these other presentations, and I haven't done that, so I'll start now. The June 2021 is about in the middle of your placemat presentation to the commission on areas of groundwater concern. This is a figure from that report that basically shows areas where we have data through various indicators that say this township, so all these squares are 36 square mile townships, where we have some amount of concern. And as part of that assessment, we looked back at the last 10 years of applications and found that more than 70% of groundwater applications result in a permit. And in these areas where we have concern or significant concern, the red areas on this map, approximately 80% of applications receive permits. Okay, so in our very first meeting, participant that was a water rights consultant said, well, yes, that makes sense because we understand your rules, and if we know that there's going to be a denial, then we say, you know, we tell our clients, don't even worry about applying. And I would take that a step further and say, yep, that's right. And also, because we have these aspects of our rules that set up these guidelines, then their job is also to say, okay, well, we can avoid a negative finding by doing this, that, the other. So I'm going to talk about three concepts. The first two are grouped together. They address, again, the source of water to wells that is from stream flow capture. And I'm going to start here with a definition of overappropriation in our Division 400 rules that says that overappropriation occurs when groundwater development results in the further depletion of already overappropriated surface waters. So again, got this picture that we've seen before of groundwater well pumping at some longer time. The cone of compression has reached out, has touched the hydraulically connected stream, and we're capturing stream flow. So that's the basic block diagram picture of groundwater development resulting in depletion of surface water. And if that surface water is overappropriated, then that definition is met. Over a series of rule developments and policy developments, we've taken that definition and we have constrained it such that functionally what we say is, you know, we are going to protect against interference from wells, again, developed within a mile of a surface water body, and for impacts that occur within an irrigation season. And one of the reasons that has led to further base flow reduction is because that's not where the impacts end, and often the impacts of groundwater development build over time. And so this figure that I have up here is from an actual modeled analysis. This is in the Deschutes Basin, where we have a numerical computer model where we can estimate impacts or when a well is turned on, how stream flow depletion works. So this is essentially the same type of plot as I showed with the increasing stream flow depletion with time, decreasing capture from storage over time. So time here is quantified in months. Realize it's probably not super intuitive to think of months in 50-year month chunks, but basically this is a 30-year time period. So think about this as 30 years on the x-axis. And then this is only the stream depletion part. of the source of water to wells from 0% stream depletion up to 100% off the top of the graph. And so again, in this case, in this computer simulation, the well in this case turned on here at month 4950. And just like we saw before in the overall conceptual figure, the amount of water that that well was pumping coming from stream flow depletion grew over time. So we see that happening here. In this case, after 1 year, about 3% of the water from that pumping well came from stream flow depletion. However, as that well continues to pump, the amount of water from stream flow depletion grows and grows until after 30 years, from these 3 streams shown here, the cumulative stream depletion total is a bit 85–90%, right? So after 30 years of pumping, most of the water coming from that well is coming from groundwater that would otherwise have discharged to base flow. And this is just one well. So if you imagine the second well and the third well and the fourth well in this basin, they're all cumulative, right? So that just builds and adds to each other. So, you know, over 30 years, 100% of this well or close to it is coming from stream flow depletion. Similar things are happening for every other well, such that the amount of water coming out of the groundwater system through wells over a long period of time is going to be roughly equal to the amount of depletion of base flow in that surface water system. And again, right now, we're not fully considering that when we get a new application. We look at that new application by itself as a single unit, and we judge it based on its local conditions. So one concept, again, for meeting our commission's request that we look at protecting senior users and developing a long-term sustainable groundwater management system is to start to look further out in time, start to look at, hey, are these wells hydraulically connected to surface water? And then find those hydraulically connected surface waters and look at our surface water availability system, right? We have a separate water availability reporting system where we've tracked natural flow over time and allocated surface water rights. And if those areas are over allocated, then we're meeting that definition from Division 400 I started with that says further depletion of already over allocated surface waters. So this is a map of available stream flow for new allocations in August, and anything that's tan here is no water available. So essentially those are all the over allocated streams in August. And under this concept, a well that's hydraulically connected to those streams that's going to further nick away at that stream flow, perhaps we propose then to deny those new applications. You'll see that this there's some white space here, some space where we don't have these flows quantified or in our surface water availability reporting system. And so part 2 of this concept is to take a look at the surface water regulation history of particular water bodies. This is a pretty generalized map, just showing, you know, there's at least one stream in each of these basins that's regulated back to the point where only people with priority dates of whatever date is up there, 1869 for the Deschutes, just to pick a random one. You know, there's some stream in there where we regulate back to an 1869 user, right? And most streams where we regulate, we're regulating back to someplace. All those places are going to be senior to a new groundwater right application, right? So a new groundwater right application is going to incrementally affect, again, users that have been using this resource for quite a long time. All right, I'm gonna switch gears slightly, talk here on these last couple slides about source of water to wells being pumpage of storage, right? So in areas where we have wells that are not really well connected to streams. In this case that I've got up here, I've got a number of wells in the Willamette Valley, deeper wells in Columbia River faults, just north of the Mount Angel area, Mount Angel groundwater limited area here specifically. And we have water level trends. So these wells are tapping deep basalts. They're not, they're quite deep, separated from surface water by quite a bit, and water levels that started out about 100 feet above mean sea level in the 90s. I should say they started out where we started collecting data in the 90s. We're at about 100 feet elevation, and over time, groundwater development has led to pumping of mostly storage, and that pumping of storage has been seen in reduction of water levels over the years down to where we are now in the 50-ish foot range. We have not been issuing new groundwater rights here for some time because we recognize this. And our statute says we shall maintain reasonably stable water levels. We do not have that term defined right now, except for a couple critical groundwater areas in the Umatilla Basin. What we do have defined is excessively decline, and that has a number of criteria to it, but one that's really easy to understand is 50 feet decline from the highest recorded water level. So in this case, for at least a handful of these wells, we have reached that definition of excessively declined, and hopefully it's not too much of a stretch to say that's not reasonably stable, right? So water's not in bubble. But for many other parts of the state, even where we do have data, things aren't so straightforward. So I'm going to show another series of hydrographs, again from the Deschutes Basin. They're going to be wells that start over here near Black Butte Ranch and run roughly east through Sisters, through Redmond, over to Powell Butte. And I'm going to use this Sisters fault zone shown in gray here as a demarcator on the hydrograph, just for orientation. And this hydrograph is a little bit different because these wells are over a very large distance across the basin. We've basically said the water level in 1995 is the starting point, and that's 0. And then the change in water level over the years from that starting point is what's plotted here. And so starting at the top here, a number of wells, again, west of the Sisters Fault Zone, near the Cascades, near the regional recharge area, we see that water levels rose 20 or more feet and fell again, rose and fell over the last 25 years. And essentially that is mirroring decadal climate cycles in the Cascades, wet and dry cycles. So from the perspective of a new groundwater right application in that area, we can look at those trends and say, yeah, I think that that's reasonably stable, right? There's up and down, it's moving with the climate, but overall, things are relatively stable. And 25 years later, we're at a point where we're 10 feet higher than we were in 1995. However, the further away from the Cascades we get, the more murky this assessment of reasonably stable becomes. So we have a well that's within the Sisters Fault Zone. It started off following a similar trend to those wells west of the Sisters Fault Zone, and then after the mid-2000s, it kind of fell off trend. So it was tracking with these, and now there's just a little bump instead of the big bump we see here. And that raises a question. Well, it used to track with the climate cycle, now it doesn't. Is that reasonably stable or not? That's unknown. It's not defined right now. As we get further east, then we have some wells that have been perhaps relatively stable. They've been about the same, and then again, at some point they start to decline, and these are declining at about half a foot a year. And so there's a question: is half a foot a year decline reasonably stable? And if so, then what about these next set of wells that are even further east? They're declining more like a foot a year, right? So once we get down here, we've dropped 30 feet in 25 years. So we haven't met any definitions of excessively declined, but hopefully it's relatively obvious we're headed that way, and we're probably going to get there in the next 20 years. And so do we want to issue more groundwater rights and hasten our approach to this excessively decline? Or do we want to think about a little more proactively, hey, that's not reasonably stable, let's stop issuing and use this time to understand what our options are before we start. So again, those are just two kind of main things that stick out to me from my perspective. A couple solutions that might address those issues, but we're really here tonight to listen to what folks' thoughts and feelings are about how we can evaluate new applications for new groundwater rights coming in, so that we can be, again, more protective of our existing users, right? People that already have water rights, that are already using this water, and how we can manage the groundwater resource so that it's as sustainable as possible into the future, so that we have this resource to depend upon as we go forward. Okay. So thank you very much.
Well, you are the first group to applaud, Justin, so well done. Could you go to the next slide? It's just a reminder for our virtual. So for our virtual attendees, thanks for hanging in there. We recognize the camera was not on Justin, but it sounded like people were able to follow along with the presentation really well. If you'd like to get in the queue for virtual attendees, to use the raise your hand function to get in the queue. And then when you're recognized, we'll ask you to state your name and your organization, and use your webcam if you're comfortable. And for folks in the room, what I'm going to do is I'll come around with the microphone. I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. If you're with an organization or an agency or a farmer or industry, just let us know that. It's helpful, and you can ask your question. So what we'd like to do is have the first 10-15 minutes or so of just any clarifying questions that came up in the presentation. And then we'd like to move into your input to answer the questions that Justin put on the screen. If you want to go back to that one, we'll keep that up there. Yep, so these are, and then, and you also, their questions are also repeated in the survey. So I see one hand up in the room and one hand up online. So we'll start with our room. So just introduce yourself and let us know who you're with.
Yeah, Larry Nicholson, the Upper Climate Basin Ag Collaborative. What does irrigation efficiencies, how can that impact the amount of water from existing wells? If you put that, can you model that? Where you could show how that would impact or increase the groundwater level by efficiencies?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I have seen a couple papers on irrigation efficiency that essentially shows, so let's think about inefficient, older irrigation styles. So flood irrigation, let's say, is that a fair, older style? Let's say that there's flood irrigation, groundwater pumping, and imagine putting, pumping out of the ground and flooding the ground. There's a lot of infiltration. Some of that is taken up by the crops, and then some of that we call return flow, right? So we often have this consumptive use criteria that we find. So we issue rights for 3 acre-feet per acre irrigation application, and the plants take up something less than that, 2.5 to 1.8 acre-feet per acre, depending on the climate, the crop, and what have you. With efficient irrigation, let's say then you only apply the 2 acre-feet per acre that the crop comes up, and you add really good monitoring of your subsurface, so you don't get any return flow, you're just using like a pump. In that situation, then yes, you would pump less, right? And that would be great. That's a great conservation measure, and we try to support that or encourage that. However, that basically means that you aren't getting any return flow. So everything you pump is now going out. And some papers that I've seen have shown that, not necessarily in Oregon with our water rights regime, but that can lead to actually more groundwater use because people are going to grow more crops that way. And they're going to increase yield. So it's not, it has potential to go both ways. We can think about how it would work, and in an ideal case, we'd use less, and we should all be, as efficient as
I'm
we
just
can be.
talking about
So,
existing users
Yeah.
using the same property. You have a model that goes over 30 years.
Yeah.
Can you model that to show a percentage of efficiency to show how that would have an impact? So, I mean, you need that to look at future years, don't you? If a whole basin, wherever.
Yeah.
If you had an effort to get efficiency in irrigation.
Yeah.
Okay, can you figure out a way to model that, show how that would improve the groundwater levels in the future?
So I believe the answer is yes, for those basins in which we already have or will in the future build one of these numerical computer models of the system. Yes, that's possible.
So we got another question in the room, and then there's one online and a question in the chat. So we'll move to online after you. Organization.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Conrad with Water Climate Trust. I live in the upper Klamath Basin, Wood River, and also in the lower. Water right holder in both places. The characterization of the problem was excellent. I was involved with writing and helping implement California's groundwater law, so you've captured it very well. The problem I have is with the opening slide. Will not affect regulation of existing water rights. So you've characterized the problem well, and you're going to solve it if you're only dealing with new allocations. It's one thing to kick away the ladder, but it's quite another to address wasteful and unreasonable water use like happens in the Wood River Valley and elsewhere. So is there a plan? If this is not the process, what is? If there is no process, who do I need to convince?
Yeah, this is a separate, and like I started out with, a fairly focused process that's going to be looking at maybe to spin it a little bit differently. Let's stop the bleeding from getting worse. So we want to take a modern approach to water right allocation and make sure that if we do issue new permits, we can make positive findings that water is available for that use without injury to other senior users or putting an aquifer system in jeopardy of being over appropriated and starting water levels in that declining trend. It's a separate issue and certainly as important to look at basins that are over appropriated with groundwater, and we have a number of them around the state that we're struggling with. We're starting a separate rule process, what we call our Division 10 rules, that will look at how the state will go and adopt new critical groundwater area provisions for specific basins around the state. And let me be clear there, it's a statewide rule that gives us the process to adopt critical groundwater areas. The actual basin by basin process will be another rule process in that specific basin.
And I would just suggest that the lowest hanging fruit is to eliminate waste versus curtailing junior users, which is economically more painful. There's plenty of waste that can be viewed as low hanging fruit. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Let's go to online. Caleb Galloway, you're first in the queue. Go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Let us know who you're with.
I'm Caleb Galloway. I'm with the Applegate Partnership and Watershed Council. I'm the riparian restoration manager. I appreciate your presentation. I was curious in tracking of the base flow levels. Is there a way to account for water that is appropriated not through the allocation process? We have a lot of issues out here with people just taking water out of the river, which would also affect base flow levels and could be interpreted as well usage, but it could be from other factors. And I was wondering if that was accounted for in the charting.
Thanks, Caleb. Good question. I think what you're talking about would be unauthorized uses from surface water. That is something that our water masters look for. They'll float larger streams and do what we call a point of diversion inventory, making sure that the pumps and ditches they find are associated with water rights, and that the amount of water they're diverting is appropriate for the water right or water rights on that particular point of diversion. Another type of water use that we don't explicitly account for are the exempt wells that I talked about. We have 280 some thousand in our well log database. So those would be well logs that have been submitted over the decades. There's probably easily another 100,000 wells in the state, we estimate, that were older wells, for which we have no well construction information. And all of those uses sum up to some amount of cumulative use that can impact both groundwater levels and stream-based flows. And we recognize that it's there, but we don't have measuring and monitoring on all of those wells out there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks, Caleb. John Short, online, you are our next person. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know who you're with. Don't forget to unmute. There you go.
John Short, Water Rights Services. I'm out of Bend, Oregon, but we do water rights throughout the state. Just wanted to confirm in the example where you showed the drawdown in the Deschutes Basin over, well, since 1995 or so, that the contributing factors to that, the water levels dropping are more than just pumpage, but those are also canal leak, canals being lined and piped, as well as climatic conditions. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So there was a joint USGS OWRD study published in 2018-ish, 2017 perhaps, that looked at a period record from the 90s through 2013, I believe it was, and concluded that water level declines were could be attributed to in the from most to least impact climate impacts, pumping, canal lining. So the report looked at those three sources, and there are specific percentages that were assigned for wells closer to the Cascade Crest or further. But I think that in all cases it went in that order.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, John. Pat, I see your hand up, but we also have a question in the chat, and Ivan's going to answer that. And then Pat, I'm going to let you ask your question, and then we have 5 hands up in the room, so I'm going to switch back to the room. So Ivan, if you want to answer the one in the chat.
Sure, Bill's got a question there. Future single home domestic wells will not be limited regardless of concern rating. Again, this process only deals with larger groundwater uses that are not exempt uses. These would be the uses that require a permit or authorization from the state of Oregon to pump that groundwater for the various uses. That's what the new allocation policy is focused on right now.
All right, thanks for that. Pat, I'm going to get you online. Go ahead and turn your video on if you like. Unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Let us know who you're with. And then I'm going to go to the 5 folks we have in the room who are queued up. So go ahead, Pat.
Okay, I'm Pat, and I just want to know it. I'm in the neighborhood off the Green Springs, and people are starting to do this. They're putting in these cisterns, and they're getting. And I'm sure they're permitted, and the water's changing. Like this one pond, I've been here for 50 years, and this one pond, it doesn't have any water anymore. And I know he's changed the flow. What do I do?
So, Pat, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by cisterns, but if folks are capturing rainwater, in Oregon, you're legally allowed to take rainwater from an impervious surface, so a roof. Barn roofs are good examples, and you can store that water in a tank and then use it for later use. You don't need a permit for that. If folks are constructing ponds or reservoirs and storing water in those are required to have water use authorizations from our agency. And, you know, the appropriate, if you think someone's doing that without a water right, they should contact the local water master here in Medford, Siobhan Haynes, and he can look into that for you.
Thanks for that
Okay.
information, Pat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. I'm going to move to the questions in the room, and you're first, so go ahead and let us know who you are.
Thanks. My name is Rick Parsons. I'm a water rights engineer, Parsons Water Consulting. And at the beginning of the conversation, Justin, you indicated something about looking at statewide rules. And is that a one-size-fit-all comment, or is it just me? Or I guess my question is, can you go a basin plan approach, which seems pertinent? And I understand it's a little more difficult, a lot more difficult, but you know, things are different, and I wonder how much of that orange and red would go away if you didn't look at scenic waterways in the Rogue River Basin. That's a concerning factor.
Yeah, so I'll go backwards. So absolutely, the red law in the road basin is based on scenic waterway impacts. So that's a separate consideration in the overall review process, and groundwater that's hydraulically connected to scenic waterways is what's turning most of those to concern. So for the first part, I'll turn that around and just confirm that sounds to me like a statement of we'd appreciate more localized rules that might be in basin programs. That's a good spot for them. I did indicate at the beginning that what we're looking at now would be statewide rules or just assessing, right? When I say that we are limiting ourselves by rule and policy to looking at surface water impacts from wells within a mile and pumping impacts within a year. That's our Division 9 rules for folks that are more familiar with those. And, you know, from my perspective, we should address those statewide rules. I don't believe that excludes the potential for basic program rules to interact as well. It's right in that language.
All right. Tim. Introduce yourself. Let us know who you are.
I'm Tim Vargas. I'm a Clement irrigator. I guess kind of what worries me a little bit is we're looking at the groundwater. We've got a lot of issues over there besides groundwater. And it seems like maybe we're looking at that the well pumping is dropping the aquifer 20 feet, the number that we've talked about in the last little bit. But I think what we got to look at is we've got Fort Klamath, Sprague River, all these areas that used to heavily irrigate that have been getting called for 5 or 6 years, and they are not putting water out on that ground like they used to put water. That water is going down the river into the lake, and you showed a graph that said water that goes away is filled in somewhere. Well, we're sending hundreds of thousands of acre feet of water out of that basin year in and year out, again and again. And I think that we're putting all the onus on the wells in this meeting, when a big part of that problem is coming from we're exporting water out of an area where that water used to stay there. And so I talked with Ivan before the meeting. He talked about OWRD's talking about drilling some wells down there where we can monitor what's going on when they start the California wells, when Fort Klamath's not irrigating, all that stuff, to where we got some real life data to back up what we're doing. I absolutely want our groundwater to be sustainable. I want to have a number that I can tell my kids, this is how much water we can take out of the ground. But we've had so much pain over there in the last 20 years because of all this water stuff that we have to make this process that we're talking about the most painless that we can. And it sounds to me like right now, we've already kind of decided that's it. We're done giving permits in Klamath County. I don't feel like that's the approach. I feel the approach is to drill these wells, get some stuff going and get some real data to where when we make those decisions, it's not a spotted out decision that 20 years later we go, oh, that didn't work. It's a decision that actually does work and it was come to as a group and it was well thought out. And I feel like we're kind of rushing to say no right now. And I understand we got some problems, but this needs to be thought out well.
Thanks for that, Tim. Haven't just anything to say about Tim's idea, and I'm writing ideas down up on the chart too. And then you're next.
Well, I guess, I hear your concern. I'm not sure.
That wasn't really a question.
Yeah, okay, just making sure, yeah.
Just didn't know, anything to share.
Yeah, thank you.
So introduce yourself, let us know who you're with.
I'm Kevin Gill with Plowser Drilling in Grants Pass. We work in Oregon and California. And my question is a clarifying question for the source of the declining water level data. Just want to better understand the methods and who, where, and where. Are they, so it's a 2 or 3 part question. Are they observation wells only or some of the data points permitted wells? And then who is taking the water level measurements? Is it OWRD staff or some of it self-reported? And then what kind of equipment is being used for the data, sophisticated data logging equipment or manual measurements? And then exempt use versus domestic, or exempt use versus permitted on your data points. So there's a lot there, but I just want to better understand how we're getting the data.
Sure, okay.
Thanks for that. Good thing there's only 3 parts. Huh?
Yeah. Plus one. So first part, if I remember these correctly, will take the data comes from a variety of sources. So the department collects water levels from about 1,200 wells across the state. In addition to that, relatively modern groundwater rights from, I would say, roughly the late 90s on, generally have come with a permit condition that says measure your well and report that data to the department. Early on, those were time limited. 7 years was the common time period. Currently, like for the newest rights, it's measure your well every year. So we get, I don't know the exact number, but something on the order of 700-800 additional water level measurements in March from those permitted wells. The wells that we go out and measure, the majority of them are existing wells. I think the majority of them are probably permitted wells, but we also measure domestic wells. We also measure wells that we've installed ourselves on ODOT right-of-ways or what have you. So it comes from a variety of sources. The reported water levels we do require, we have a series of qualified people to take those water levels, and so that includes drillers, consultants, other staff that are familiar with the equipment. A relatively small subset, but 100 plus wells have data logging pressure transducers in them that operate at 2 hours or less intervals. So we get high frequency data from some wells, but the majority of our wells are measured between 1 and 4 times a year. Okay. Have I hit on everything that you asked? All right, perfect. I'm gonna add real quick that all those wells are publicly available through our website. We have something called the Groundwater Information System. So you can get there online from our homepage. And we've got a map viewer where you can zoom around, go to your area of interest, find the nearest observation well, and pull up that data. So that's all available to look at. And
Thanks, Justin. So we have 2 more folks in the room. I invite people online to please raise your hand if you want to get in the queue. And we'll switch to folks online after the next 2 people in the room. Introduce yourself and let's-
Thank you. Gene Souza, Klamath Irrigation District, I'm the executive director for the district. My job is to take surface water from Klamath Lake and deliver it to the former lakes and marshlands that used to be in the Klamath Basin for agricultural purposes. So taking surface water, reapplying surface water actually would have been, so that's my job, and we'll do that for you. Prior to 2001, there wasn't a groundwater, or large groundwater basin. But since 2001, with the changes in taking water away from where it's naturally supposed to be, or naturally would have been, has resulted in farmers like Tim and Dave and many others in this room having to get these groundwater permits and tap into that resource. To get to my question for this part is the Rules Advisory Committee that I mentioned. First question that is, what are the qualifications to be on that committee? Second, how many are going to be on that committee, or is there a limit? Because once you get too many, you're probably ineffective. But to kind of get an idea of what that committee size is. What's the policies for giving us balance in the stakeholders that are going to be on the committee? Make sure we have a good representation across the state, across the folks that are interested in groundwater, and folks that I represent that need access to it. And then the final question on that line is, what access to data will those committee members have to help them analyze what rules are needed? So I know we do have the ongoing information for individual wells, but Oregon Water Resource Department has its own staff to give the committee a view of what the problems are and what rules are needed. But is there additional data that committee members can take away to go analyze themselves and identify if there's other things that could be potentially impacting groundwater that needs to be addressed in this rule?
Thanks, Gene. See if I can
So it's
hit all of those.
it's,
Yeah.
qualifications, size, representation, and access to data.
So as far as qualifications, some interest in water. We try and get as diverse of folks on a rack as we can. And in this day and age, want to broaden that out as much as we can. Historically, racks have been 12 to 15, maybe as many as 20 people. I think that number is definitely going to go up for issues as important as this, the Division 10 rules that I talked about earlier. As we broaden out and try and get as much diversity on the rack as possible. And again, from a qualification perspective, some interest in the natural resource water there. We like to get different backgrounds and expertise. So groundwater users, surface water users, municipalities, nurseries, depending on where you're at in the state, the type of user varies. But you don't need to be a hydrogeologist, you don't need to be an engineer or have any particular expertise from that perspective. And
Access to data.
access to data. So certainly, as Justin mentioned, we have a lot of data that's available online. If the Rule Advisory Committee has specific requests, I always look at the first RAC meeting as an opportunity to roll out the draft rules. We have to start someplace, and that's kind of the starting point Two then is to do some education and outreach. Justin's been working the last number of years in the Harney Basin. We've just wrapped up, a couple of years ago, we wrapped up a 5-year study with the USGS out there. There's been a subset of the community out there that served as a groundwater study advisory committee, and they've been brought along for 5-6 years with the scientists and the science at quarterly to semi-annual meetings. And so they're relatively familiar with the study process, the study data inputs, and then the results of those studies. That's a couple dozen people. It's not the thousands that actually live out there. So we'll hold some public meetings out there in November to help roll that information out to folks before a RAC forms for their process. But again, if the RAC has particular data needs and requests, we can try and accommodate that as quickly as we can.
Thanks for that, Ivan. And again, I invite people online, if you'd like to get in the queue, to please raise your hand. This is our last question we have in the room so far, but if there are other people in the room who would like to speak, do raise your hand as well.
Hi, I'm Angelina Cook. I work with Ashland Climate Collaborative, but most of my watershed experience is in California. I also have a 3-part question. Can I ask you one at a time? Let's see here. I understand how you collect groundwater elevation data, and I'm curious on how you monitor bulk water well pumpers. Like, do they self-report, or how do you regulate that existing users are staying within their permitted right?
Good question. So there's a couple of different ways. We do have a law here in Oregon that public entities are required to measure and report water use. So Gene is an example with Klamath Irrigation District. They have to measure their diversions of water from the source, Upper Klamath Lake, and they have to report that on an annual basis to the department. City of Ashland does the same, City of Medford, any of those public entities. So that rolls up all the municipalities, irrigation districts, drainage districts, things like that. As Justin mentioned, in more recent years, probably the last 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of the newer groundwater rights have required flow meters to be installed as part of a permit condition, and the water user to report that water use to the department on an annual basis. So in an ideal world, a water user is collecting monthly readings, and then they report that data to us usually by the end of the calendar year. We're on a little wonky system. We go on a water year, October 1st through the end of September. And that data for the previous water year, like this water year, will be reported around early next calendar year to the agency.
And what about private ag wells?
Private agricultural wells, if they're a newer groundwater right, they'll have that metering and reporting condition. If they're older groundwater rights, they're not required to measure or report, with some exceptions out there.
Okay, and what was that threshold for a larger groundwater user that would qualify for this allocation conversation? It sounded like de minimis users were not necessarily being evaluated in this process, but I'm just curious, what is that threshold?
Yeah, again, this process focuses on groundwater uses that exceed the existing exempt uses that are in our statutes. And so I think the second slide that I was speaking to, the exempt groundwater uses are 15,000 gallons per day for single or a group domestic, a half-acre lawn and non-commercial garden. That's the one that people slip up on. They like a big yard and a big garden. You can also use 5,000 gallons per day for commercial or industrial use. And then stock water, whether you have 1 cow or 100,000 cows, that's an exempt use.
Okay, thanks. And then my last question is, I'm curious if you've had to issue any curtailments with this drought, or if your groundwater pumping is as bad as it is in California in your experience. I'm wondering if you're experiencing extreme consequences like land subsidence or complete dewatering of rivers.
I'm not aware of any dewatering of rivers or streams from groundwater pumping. The California Department of Water Resources recently posted some information, satellite data on their website. There is the beginnings of subsidence occurring along the Oregon-California border. And that's been something that California is very sensitive to. They do have parts of the state that have over the decades sunk tens of feet from groundwater withdrawals. From a curtailment perspective, in Oregon right now, there is two mechanisms, well, three, that we would curtail someone. If they're pumping more water than they're entitled to under their water right, our water master staff can shut them back to what they're entitled to. If they have a permit decline condition on their water right, so that's, Justin showed a bunch of the water level data. If they're reporting water level data and they've dropped more than 25 feet from a reference level that's been established, we have regulated off a handful of users across the state because of triggering those decline conditions. And then the third mechanism by which we curtail people is this critical groundwater area designation. And there are basins and subbasins where we have established these critical groundwater areas and have permanently shut off groundwater users there because the resource wasn't available to support their continued use without injuring and continuing to injure the senior users there.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any other hands up online. Are there?
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, a question in the chat. Can you, let's go ahead. Ivan, can you read it?
Oh, Matt Walter. Okay, hi Matt. He is asking, is this establishing new well application rules the same thing as establishing a critical groundwater area? No, it is not. They're very different. What we're talking about today are people coming into our agency and mailing in a new application for a new groundwater use, something they've never done before. They want to start farming, they want to start aquaculture. A city wants to develop a new well field. This process would apply only to those new applicants for new groundwater rights here in the state of Oregon. Whereas the critical groundwater area process is a process by which we can control existing permitted or authorized uses that have already been issued in the past, where we've gone too far, we've over allocated the groundwater resource, and we need to start curtailing that groundwater use in order to slow the groundwater level decline or minimize impact to surface water and protect those existing senior users in that system.
Thanks for that. Hey, John, I see that your hand's up online. Let's go ahead and turn to you. And also for everyone, be sure to look at the questions that Ivan and Justin have put up on the screen. And we've heard some ideas about some criteria that people would like to see. We haven't heard too much about time scale, but it'd be great to hear those ideas as well. John, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Question is, when you showed the map of the entire state with those areas that basically there was no water, no surface water left, and groundwater impacts surface water. So are you basically saying at this point no groundwater application would be approved for all practical purposes?
John, that's really a question that we're here to seek some input on from all of you folks. You know, what Justin was trying to do is lay out there some of the data we have that could be considered for a future allocation process. If we have a stream or a stream system that's fully appropriated, over appropriated, because the water master staff are out there every summer shutting off junior users to bring water to the senior water right holders out there. Should we continue to issue groundwater rights in a basin like that, that will, in short term or in the long term, have some sort of an impact on the stream flow and further diminish that? So, you know, we're looking for input from the public on what those considerations should be.
So my question remains that you showed that almost the entire state was the tan color. Are there, are you still approving any groundwater applications in those tan colored areas?
We would be approving groundwater applications in those tan colored areas if they got through the Division 9 process. So for wells located more than a mile away or wells beyond a quarter mile that had a relatively small impact, there's the possibility that those applications would still be approved.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, John. Another question in the room, remind us who you are.
Rick Parsons, I wanted to ask, these are sort of vague, of course, but you'd mentioned before that one of your focuses is to revise or update the water availability for new or future groundwater rights. And maybe this is tied into the water availability analysis, which is used for those wells you just spoke of, and determines whether the basin is quote unquote over appropriated from a surface water perspective. Do you not add the CU of groundwater wells to the water availability analysis?
Let's
Because
see.
then I would say you are using it.
Yeah,
and
where
you're
we
using
find PSI, we do.
So you're using 100% of it. So I'm not sure how you're not looking at it in the future, other than the fact that you deplete the river for 6 months and then it depletes it, year long in real life.
Yeah, so I'm gonna frame your question a little bit differently and see if I can get it out there for the rest of the audience. We have a surface water availability model that's based on stream flow data from around the state, and on streams where we don't have data, they extrapolate nearby data into those basins and correct it for differences in basin size, all kinds of different things. And that was the TAN map that Justin showed up there. It showed the availability of surface water during the month of August across the state of Oregon. I think, Rick, your question is, well, when we issue a new groundwater right, do we debit some amount of water from that surface water availability model? Is it accounting for that? And my understanding is it only does so when we make a finding of potential for substantial interference. That does get debited from it, but where we don't make a finding of PSI, then it's not. There's no additional consumptive use attributed to that groundwater right within the surface water availability.
And I guess, yeah, so what does the update mean? And why you don't issue water rights for PSI? So why would you take it out? But I mean,
Okay. So if we find PSI and there is water available, then we issue the right and debit it. And Ivan did mention that's consumptive use. So getting back to the very first question, with more efficiency, we're debiting, we're discounting, right, the face value of the water right to what we calculate as the consumptive use. So if we provide a water right for 3 acre-feet per acre, we're only debiting the surface water system for 1.8 acre-feet per acre, what have you. But as people get more efficient, we're still making that assumption, even though that's not a true assumption. And also, as we've debited surface water, and we are not debiting for any of the wells that are developed beyond a mile from that hydraulically connected stream. So we haven't subtracted that, if you will, from the balance of wards or the water availability reporting system. But those impacts have continued to develop over time. So
is that what the update is? That's what I don't understand, is what's being updated?
Yeah, so the surface water availability model is not this. This is the process by which we will review a new groundwater application that comes in the door. How will we go about reviewing that? What criteria will we use to come up with a finding the agency has to come up with a finding that water is available for the new proposed use. So the water availability model, surface water availability model may be a component of that review process. It is today as well. It may become in a different fashion. But what we're really talking about updating is the allocation process and policy for the agency. When a new groundwater application comes in the door, what will that review process look like? It will be different than what we are doing today.
Because you want to get rid of, it cannot be determined. There's not enough data to determine whether it will have a negative impact. It's just, per the December 2021 WRC recommendation to establish a definitive findings with data available via a conservative approach to consider long-term effects on surface water uses. And since most everywhere around here, there's not enough data, at least in this basin, and in the Umpqua, there's not enough data to come to the conclusion unless you're having well-to-well interference. Because that's the goal. You don't want to have, you want to say yes or no, not maybe.
Correct.
It's a crude way to put it, but that is where you're the goal.
Okay, thanks for that. We got another question in the room here. Introduce yourself, let us know who you're with.
My name is Christopher Hall with Waterly, and I want to ask a really simple question. Is this process being driven by increasing water scarcity in various basins throughout the state?
Chris, I think that's part of the discussion, and I think it's part of a recognition that some of the rules and policies we've operated under don't do full justice to the scientific understanding of groundwater development in our hydrologic systems. So it's a little bit of both there. We are facing more water scarcity. That's a function of drought, but a drought's an annual thing, right? Except it's been 10 out of the last 12 years in much of Oregon. And so water scarcity is something that is increasing in many basins across the state. The last 2 years, our agency and local agencies have been inundated in some basins with dry well complaints. Southwest Oregon is a good example of that in Klamath County, Deschutes County, Jackson County. Those numbers have continued to grow through this year. And so I think it's really more apparent to all of us that not only are we getting less supply, but with the longer growing seasons and the warmer temperatures, the consumptive use is going up. The demand for water is going up. And that's pushing folks to pump more, pump earlier, pump longer in the season. And all of those things put together is stressing the system like it's never been stressed before.
Thank you for the clarification. By water scarcity, I meant increasing acidification, which is a permanent drying out, as opposed to the cyclical drought that we're experiencing. Thank you.
Okay, a couple more questions in the room. And again, I invite people online, if you'd like to ask a question or provide some input to the questions that are on the screen, just raise your hand to get in the queue.
Gene Souza with Klamath Irrigation District. So what we've seen in the presentation earlier, I would categorize as a Klamath basin specifically. We're talking state level. Klamath basin is kind of upside down. To clarify that by saying that we have a bunch of surface water. Our surface water was available for millennia. It wasn't on former lake lands, it wasn't in marshes. And when the surface water was applied, it reapplied, recharged the weather. It created its own weather pattern. And as you showed it earlier in the weather cycle, that water would evaporate 3 to 5 acre feet per acre over those former marshlands and wetlands. That water would then evaporate, create its own cloud cover, would go then in the north and northeast from the Klamath Basin, precipitate back in the Saikan and other kind of areas, get that water back in the system and then recycle. So Ivan and I talked a little earlier about seeing decline inflows into Upper Klamath Lake. Well, when you don't have that weather pattern being reestablished like it was naturally, Of course, you're gonna see decline flows because you don't have a natural weather cycle, because we interrupted it by drying out, not putting water back on the surface water back on the surface where it naturally was. So when we talk about these rules, what we've seen in the Klamath Basin since 2001, most of the groundwater wells that have been put in within the boundaries of my district are supplemental to the surface. I know Oregon Water Resource Department has a memorandum of agreement, memorandum of understanding between governments, you rock tribes, that says you're not going to enforce or do anything with Klamath adjudication as it relates to the Klamath project. In that memorandum of understanding, the Oregon Water Resources Department's failure to enforce Klamath adjudication and all that water to go surface water goes back on them, we're exacerbating the problem. And as we look at these rules and how we put these rules in effect, in Klamath Basin, I define it as what I've seen today and what I've seen in the past several months in presentations, Klamath Basin being upside down to your model presentation. Is there a way, as Mr. Parsons mentioned earlier, that we can focus on basin specifics so that a statewide approach that allows local communities, local leadership, local folks that understand the areas, understand the interactions, understand the impacts of communities, our ecosystems, and not having an agency that's several hundred miles away, it's not involved in our communities, doesn't live with us, doesn't feel the impact of some policymaker that is important. I've just retired, making decisions for us. So,
Thanks for that. Oh, Ivan, you want to say something?
Well, I was just gonna, as Justin tried to do earlier, Gene, I think, and Jamie's got it up here, you know, if you believe that local-based rules are gonna be more accurate, better, helpful to your basin, then certainly put that down as a suggestion, you know.
It sounds like a lot of what we're trying to do here is protect the senior water right holders. And in Klamath, how much conflict do we have? Are we having right now with senior water right holders?
You know, I don't really know how to get at the conflict. There's a tremendous amount of regulation going on in the Klamath Basin to protect the senior water right holders for surface water. Right now, with respect to groundwater, I'm not aware that we're doing any regulation down there between like well-to-well interference, nor have we regulated any of the permit conditions down.
Right, and so at this time, there doesn't seem to be a problem with the senior water right holders as far as well interference.
Well, yeah, I would say that I've got 300 plus domestic wells that have gone dry in the last 2 years, and those folks probably wouldn't agree with that, be it junior or senior. It's a complicated issue, but as we talked earlier tonight, the groundwater use in the Klamath Basin, the lack of recharge in the basin has created a brand new group of stakeholders that are now short of water that we didn't have 2 years ago. And so that's really expanded the issue, and it's going to expand the complexity of solving some of these problems. And also, when you're out of domestic water, the level of urgency goes up fairly quickly.
And I don't want to discount that at all, but I also want to say those wells are not senior water right holders. And it seems to me that there's an answer to that goes beyond regulating people that have lesser water rights than the senior water right holders that are permitted.
Yeah, so Tim, let me just make sure I'm hearing you correctly. Exempt wells are exempt from the need to obtain a permit. They have a priority date. And so an old exempt well down there is going to be more senior than a junior permitted right. The priority date is based on the date of construction of the well. And if that's not available via well log, then any other information that we can obtain. But there is a priority date system there and they're part of it, even though they don't have a permit. So. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and give you an opportunity and then circle back around for folks who have asked the questions ready.
Hi, I'm Teresa Steiner and Mark. And my question is going right back to what they're saying. In the Klamath Basin, we didn't have problems with domestic wells going dry until you guys relieved us of irrigation water from the surface of the lake. So is there some kind of correspondence?
I'll answer this question and then we're gonna, I think, put the Klamath to rest to make sure we get to the rest of the questions here. The lack of water in the canals likely has some localized impact on leaking. The canals do leak, we know that. They don't leak very much, they leak some. And we have data from a limited number of observation wells that Justin talked about earlier that shows water levels in those wells increasing during the summer months when the canals are leaking and also when irrigation water is being spread on the fields there. How much of an impact that imparts, we don't know. It's hard to measure, it's hard to quantify relative to some irrigation districts, KID and the other water users down there. They really don't lose a high percentage of water from the canal system. It's fairly tight and that's good, it's efficient. If it was leaky, like the stuff in the Deschutes Basin, you guys would be lining canals and piping canals like the Deschutes does because they were losing many tens of a percent of what they diverted there.
So, but you're trying to tell me that you're gonna go and you're gonna try to regulate the system without the data? Because you just said you didn't have the data.
Ma'am, what I'm talking about tonight is new groundwater allocation policy. So we're trying to modernize the policy for folks who want to come in and get new groundwater rights. The project area is not going to get new groundwater rights because water levels are dropping rapidly across the project area. That's been going on for 20 years, since 2001. So it's already over appropriated. We don't need any more data there to get a better sense of what groundwater is available. There's no way we could make a finding of available groundwater because of the declines in that basin.
Okay, I'm going to move over here. And again, folks online, we've got about 10 minutes left of the meeting. Go ahead and raise your hand if you want to get in the queue to offer some input or ask a question. Connor?
Hi, Conrad, Water Climate Trust. Again, I live in the upper and lower Klamath Basin, and I just want to remind everyone there are stakeholders who depend on in-stream beneficial uses of water. All of this applies to that. So yes, we can protect senior water users, but there are people who depend on water being left in rivers, and groundwater has a lot to do with that. It's basically been a free-for-all. And just gets back to your example of like who's on the advisory committee. The 6 examples you gave were all people who take water out of rivers, not people who are stakeholders and leaving it in. This was a debate with the groundwater bill in California, and we left it up to mostly water users, but their in-stream users are a beneficial use and need to be brought into this conversation a little bit more than they are.
Thanks, Conrad. And in-stream folks and conservation groups are generally always part of the rule advisory committees as well. So, and if you're interested,
a lot of them call themselves conservation, but represent ag, but yeah.
All right, go ahead and introduce yourself again.
Kevin Gill again, Clouser Drilling. I want to make a statement about wells. There are some small percentage, but yet a percentage of wells that have failed, not because they're dry, but due to improper well design or construction, or just simply the life cycle of the well. Maybe it was drilled in the 40s or 50s. It's failing, but you're taking water level measurements out of a well, and it's got a plug liner, and the water can't enter the pump chamber. You got pressure differentials when you're pumping, maybe sedimentary rocks that plug the liner. You're gonna have water level decline. So, but it may not be a dry well. So I just wanted to bring that up. And we've been running into quite a bit of that. And that's what happens when you cut corners. on drilling a well, I will give the department credit for modernizing the well construction program as part of House Bill 2145 and stepping up your efforts to make sure that people do what they're supposed to do. So that was just a comment.
Thanks, Kevin.
See your hand up. Is there any other questions online or in the chat? Are we seeing any? All right.
Rick Parsons with Parsons Water Consulting. And this is sort of tricky because obviously you're here for, you're here to get questions. And all we want, well, I'm not saying that right. You know, everyone here is looking for answers, and I don't think it's exactly what you're looking for. And that's not the overall goal. As far as over appropriation, seems to me, Klamath example, the Harney example, you know, here's the line. There's no doubt there's not water available. Now, what it is it 25% or is it 50% of the typical things you put in a well permit that you use for defining a concerned area in your 2016 maps and since then? If it's not, because you don't have data, you know, then what is it? You know, is it because, you know, saying that over appropriation is water rights in excess of the average annual recharge of a groundwater source over the period of record? Well, in your response to the 2016 Oregonian, not the training Oregonian article, the other one, I can't remember the name of, you know, you made the comment that they're over accounting for permitted well, you know, you can't just use the permitted wells because they're primary, supplemental, etc. And so they're not all jumped on top of each other. And then, you know, it's difficult from a water administration perspective not to use the full number. And also we're in a state where my water rights worth 4.5 acre-feet an acre. Whether, you know, as long as I'm ready, willing, and able to use it, if I sell it, that's what it's worth. It's not based on something to use so much. But so I guess, you know, if you don't have that data, what can we do that will give us a definitive understanding as to the allocation process? So if there's an open question, I'm not looking for an answer for the first time. It's just something to think. I guess it's a comment, but
All right, last call. Oh, you do one more?
It's not really a question, it's more a response. I apologize. So Gene Souza, Klamath Irrigation District. In a previous question was asked about surface water interaction with the groundwater within the basin. Whether we want to put this thing to bed. I did plot all the dry wells from 2021 that were given to me. I don't know if they got them all from, but the data that was given to me, I can clearly see within the boundaries of my district and my historical knowledge of growing up in basin as a kid, and my role with the past 3.5 years, and understanding where the 50 wells are at, what depth they're at, some interaction with the surface water, flood irrigation, or sewage treatment, interaction with some of those wells that we're recommending. I did get another updated spreadsheet for 2022. I think there's 110 wells that were reported. I didn't get a location for all 110. The ones I did get a location for, I plotted. And within the boundaries of my district, where I applied surface water, I don't have a problem. Where there was not surface water delivery, either because of a decision I made or because it was one of the sister districts that I serve, such as Dodds Hollow and other places. Yes, there was a problem with domestic wells outside those areas. So kind of to put on public record, and from my perspective, being on the ground, seeing and looking at it, analyzing it, my perspective as an irrigation district leader, looking at what my system is doing, applying surface water, as it has been for a long time, since 1878 in some cases, is having a positive effect on domestic wells within my land.
Again, it's another comment about the need for a local approach and the local knowledge and the history that goes with that. So Not seeing any other hands online. We're just about at the end of our time. I don't want to cut it off if there is somebody with something else that they'd really like to share. And then we just have a little bit to talk about for the next steps.
I have a question, Kevin Gill, about the RAC makeup again. A well-earned reputation for many state agencies, not signaling water resources, but is to favorably stack the RAC for a predetermined outcome. How can we be assured, as everyone that's here, the very diverse group that's here, that the RAC will be made up of a good group of people who can make good decisions for water policy in the state to protect everyone?
Kevin, it's a great question. And again, you know, from where I sit, I'm looking to get the most diverse RAC we can that has input from all groups that are out there and interested in water resources across the state. That's hard to do with numbers. But I think certainly as the RAC begins to form, you know, we can share member lists with folks, and if there are concerns about that, and bring it to our attention. You are, as citizens, you're represented by members of our Water Resources Commission. Reach out to your representatives and let them know what your thoughts and input are on the process. They ultimately are the decision makers. We will come forward with draft rules. Those will get commented on and perhaps adjusted through the RAC process. And ultimately, we have a staff report and a set of rules that are ready for adoption by the commission. They review that and vote to adopt or not to adopt, perhaps send back modifications, or in some cases, more extensive process review. So,
Which is actually a really great segue to our next steps.
yeah, thanks, Jamie. So I'll touch real quick on this. There will be a report of the meeting, and a recording of this will get posted on our project website. As I mentioned at the beginning, our last meeting will be a virtual one that's going to be on Monday afternoon, the next week from 2 to 4 p.m. The comment form that's available online is going to be open till October 19th. So please, you know, in the next couple of weeks, get any comments submitted there. We're going to be working with Kearns and West. They're going to take all of the comments that we've received over the last couple of weeks and in the next couple of weeks, do an analysis of those and put together a report that'll be made publicly available as well. And I think at some point we'll have the videos of these meetings will get posted online once we get those processed and available as well. And Justin's PowerPoint presentation will be made available also.
And this is just the time frame for the Rural Advisory Committee work.
There's no statutory requirements for rulemaking, is there?
There are rules on how to write rules, and there are timelines built into the rules on how to write rules that we pay very close attention to. So we have to do a good job of following those. You know, as an example, I think there's a minimum 30-day public comment period that's open on the rules, but there's also flexibility in that. As far as our ambitious approach to getting these adopted by late spring, we want to try and stick to that as best we can, and you know, move through the process, you know, as quickly as we can. So, thanks.
That's it. Thank you. Thank everybody.
Yeah, thank you all
Thanks
for coming.
folks online. Thanks everybody in the room. Appreciate it.
Please travel home safely.